Ancient midwives left little in the way of written works for modern midwives to study. Perhaps they were too busy tending family, delivering babies, and caring for women. Most of what we know about midwives of earliest recorded history can be found in the artwork of the period. We do know that midwives were mentioned in ancient texts, and perhaps one of the most familiar mentions of midwives in ancient days was made in the Torah when the Egyptian king commands 2 Hebrew midwives to kill all the boy babies born to Hebrew women. We know 2 things for certain about these midwives. First, they defied Pharaoh. He did not punish them. As midwives and students studying to be midwives, we can reasonably make educated guesses about what sorts of tools midwives might have had to help women at the time of their labor and delivery. Common sense and the ability to assess a woman's condition or progress from experience. Intelligence. A midwife should be reliable and available. A steady nerve to cope with any emergencies that might arise, and a reassuring presence. Skill and the ability to gain new skills. Along with this, we can surmise from art and ancient texts that there would have been more than one woman attending the birth, and perhaps a woman's husband as well. We can be sure that there would have been some kind of tools on hand to help clamp the cord and cut it. Almost all art from that period, Pharaoh's statement that it was while the women were on their stools to birth, and other texts make it very clear that birthing on stones or a stool built for that purpose, or even just a low chair or stool from around the house, were commonly used. And finally, agents for soothing and cleansing mother and child. There were authors in that dim past who made efforts to record the wisdom and work of midwives, such as Cyrannus of Ephesus, who was a scholar and physician between the 1st and 2nd century A.D.
For normal labor, one must prepare beforehand. Olive oil, warm water, warm fomentation, soft sea sponges, pieces of wool, bandages, a pillow, things to smell, a midwife's stool or chair, 2 beds, and a proper room. Oil for injection and lubrication, warm water in order that the parts may be cleansed, warm fomentation for alleviation of the pains, sea sponges for sponging off, pieces of wool in order that the woman's parts be covered, bandages that the newborn may be swaddled, a pillow that the infant may be placed upon it below the parturient woman till the afterbirth has also been taken care of, and things to smell, such as pennyroyal, a clod of earth, barley groats, as well as an apple and a quince, and, if the season permits, a lemon, a melon, and a cucumber. Everything similar to these to revive the labor.
Among the tools a midwife carried or used, Cyrannus also speaks to the midwife's character. It is not clear if this is his opinion, or if these are things he picked up from midwives along the way. He said that a midwife must be literate. She must have her wits about her. She must have a sharp memory, possess manly patience, which always causes me to chuckle a little bit. She must have the ability to recall and prescribe necessary treatments, and she must have the ability to empathize with a woman in labor. For many centuries, a midwife's wit and sense were primary tools as midwives faced persecution from cultural leaders of their time. Women were, in many cases, forbidden reading, or if allowed reading, forbidden study, particularly any study of medicine or any kind of science. We do know that while men wrote books about midwifery in these very early years of recorded history, that men were not called upon to attend births. Birth was a time when women served women and aided women. The case of Agnodice, a woman who refused to accept her culture's edict forbidding women the practice of medicine, stands out. Legend says that Agnodice was not satisfied with being a midwife only, but wanted to study to care for women in a more broad practice that wasn't limited to childbirth. Agnodice is said to have studied in Egypt, where women were allowed to study and practice medicine, and upon returning to Athens, cut off her hair and disguised herself as a man so she could practice medicine. This was all well and good, but practicing as a man, she was still limited in what care she could offer women. She eventually had to expose herself to a woman she came across alone in her travails to allow Agnodice to help her. Agnodice became so much in demand for women for general care at the time of delivery that male doctors, believing she was a man, accused her of seducing women before a court of law, a crime they wanted this upstart put to death for. It was then that Agnodice is said to have exposed her body to the court, thus doubling the objections of the men. She had broken their law forbidding women the study and practice of medicine. Now she must surely be put to death. However, this began a protest among the women of Athens that was so intense that the law was eventually amended, allowing women to study and practice medicine. History tells us that the women of Athens, in defending Agnodice, declared, "You men are not spouses but enemies, as you condemn she who discovered health for us. If she cannot come to our sick bodies, nor shall ye come to our bodies healthy." As Christianity spread throughout much of the known world, and the Catholic Church became a real power, midwives began to face the scrutiny of not only medical practitioners, but of the Catholic Church. Because of their status as cultural leaders, the men of the Catholic Church therefore required midwives to be qualified as follows. She must be literate. Literacy for women in these times might mean she could write her own name and do simple ciphering, but it did not reach to reading Latin, for example. She must be married or have been widowed. This would ensure that the potential midwife had knowledge concerning things carnal, including the bodies of women at the time of birth. She must have birthed at least one child, as it would give her experience and knowledge of the event. She must take classes from a physician. I have to laugh about this because the physicians were first taught about pregnancy and birth by midwives, and then they presumed to teach other potential midwives. It seems midwives did not have formal classes, but learned from master to apprentice. Sadly, people in this time were quite superstitious, and the leadership of the Catholic Church was not immune to this tendency. It was during this time that midwives began to be scrutinized as potential witches. This was never more evident than in the 1486 work of a pair of Dominican clergymen that was published in Germany entitled The Malleus Maleficarum, which literally means the hammer of the witches. In this book, the monks asserted that some, if not all, midwives were known to be secret witches who would often behead or by other means kill a newborn as a sacrifice to their supposed master. The midwife may even be assisting the laboring woman, who might in fact be a witch herself, to sell the child's soul to the devil for more arcane powers of her own. Abortions and birth control were also suspect and absolutely forbidden. Miscarriages were scrutinized and often cast doubt on the midwife's Christian character and qualifications. It was the Malleus Maleficarum that contains the well-known phrase, "As penitent witches have often told to us and to others, saying, no one does more harm to the Catholic faith than midwives." To the end of ensuring that women attending those in labor would be good Christian women, they must be recommended by several influential families, specifically the heads of these families, and must have a good reputation among the people that they wish to serve. She must also vow to call a physician in an emergency, perform emergency baptisms for dead or dying babies. She must hear emergency last confessions for women who may be dying in labor. She must report all miscarriages and abortions. She must report any use of contraceptives, which, as I said, was strictly forbidden. And she must report all births out of wedlock. Even after Henry VIII decided it was time for Britain to go its own way in religion, the fear of witches sacrificing the young to Satan did not diminish, and even as Catholics in the British Isles were burned as heretics, so were women accused of witchcraft, and among these, no one knows how many were midwives who simply would not submit their strong wills and traditional ways. Especially not for men, who, as far as they were concerned, had no business interfering in birth or women's care. Compromises were made, of course, and women, who were well known as having upstanding characters and great skill as midwives, were allowed to practice on the condition that they submit themselves to the scrutiny of their local clergy and take an oath concerning their practice. An example of one such oath is this: "Also I will not use any kind of sorcery or incantation in the time of the travail of any woman, and that I will not destroy the child born of any woman, nor cut, nor pull off the head thereof, or otherwise dismember or hurt the same, or suffer it to be so hurt or dismembered by any manner of ways or means. Also, that in the ministration of the sacrament of baptism in the time of necessity, I will use the accustomed words of the same sacrament and none other profane words. I will use pure and clean water, and not any rose or damask water, or water made of any confection or mixture." From the Oath of Eleanor Peed, 1567. To this point in history, we can see that much was expected of midwives and that they made many sacrifices to care for women and babes at the time of birth. We can also see that they had to be savvy and smart to escape the inquisitor's chair. The primary concerns of those who made themselves authorities over the midwives had to do with her character and eventually her suitability as a Christian, not with the tools she would use. Perhaps this has as much to do with the prevailing belief at that time that women were naturally flawed, as from the fact that the tools were considered commonplace and perhaps not worth the mentioning. Although Soranus did write a list of things to be brought to a birth by the midwife, as did published authors after him, one might be justified in assuming this was for the benefit of their audience, who was most likely male, rather than for midwives who were less likely to read their books while being trained by another midwife. From ancient writings as well as tradition, we can know without a doubt that midwives used herbal remedies for pain relief, for comfort measures, and for cleansing. Midwives also used sponges, obviously for cleansing, but also for bathing a woman's head, back, and body as a comfort measure, also for cleansing the baby. Midwives used swaddling cloths to wrap the baby in upon delivery. This first one you see here is from about 1575 and is kept in the Victoria and Albert Museum. This second one, from Alsace, France, is from sometime between 1671 and 1700. It's very interesting to see that both of these cloths bear ornamentation, which indicate that they were important to the families who used them. As time passed, more tools were used by midwives, as well as students of gynecology, such as this obstetric phantom from Italy from about the 18th century, and these midwives' tools from the instrument collection of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow, circa 1700. Of all these, this book runs as my second favorite of the bunch. This is the first textbook written for midwives by a midwife. Jane Sharp was a known midwife who had practiced somewhere between 30 and 40 years by the time her Complete Midwife's Companion, also called Midwifery Improved, was published. Improved because there had been several books written by well-known men about midwifery. One such was Nicholas Culpeper, who spent the beginning of his work, A Directory for Midwives, by lauding midwives as the finest of women and writing assurances that he did not mean to educate experienced midwives, but hoped his work might be of value to the inexperienced or women in places where there were no experienced midwives. He also invited midwives to correct any errors he might have made in his directory. Jane Sharp took him up on that offer, used much of his directory, making corrections she knew were needed, and subsequently got the work published. Lastly, and perhaps the most common of the midwife's tools, was the birth chair. Parturition, or birth chairs, of one type or another, are unique among birth tools in that they are found in the history of every culture around the world. This first image is from ancient Greece, and the next from ancient Egypt, and this last one from 1st century Rome. Common in every one of these is that the woman is seated on some sort of a stool or a stone, and that she is assisted and attended by female attendants. These next two are from Persia. The first appears to be an engraving from the middle 19th century. The second is from the 13th century. Interesting to note in this second scene is that although there is a man over her signifying her position in the world, she and her attendants are larger, the more important figures in this piece. And lastly is a figure carved from the South Pacific Islands, a woman birthing alone on a stone seat. Birth chairs were as varied as the cultures they came from. Here is an engraving of a birth by French doctor Ambroise Tardieu from about the middle 19th century. This is a Greek woman being held on a birth stool by her husband while a midwife assists her and another attendant cares for the newly born infant. You can see in the lower left of the engraving a birth stool wrapped in cloths, presumably to pad the wooden seat. Next is a folding birth chair from Africa, then this one called a sandigan from the tribes of the Philippines Islands. Then a Syrian birth chair, illustrated in the middle 19th century by Georges Davy. I noticed in particular the carving and ornamentation on this chair, which led me to believe it was for a more affluent family. and this chair from Fayoum, Egypt, so plain I thought it must not have belonged to an affluent family. You can see on this chair from the late 18th century, which was designed by a physician named de Venter, that hand grips were added and buckets were thought of to collect the mess. Then here we have one from Germany from 1554, which, although it is plain, is done up with some skirting, perhaps as a nod to the feminine task it is meant for. This next is also from Germany in 1532, and unlike its German counterpart, lacks even a reclined back. As we can see with this next example, again from Germany, this time from the 17th century, it was perhaps not unusual for a regular chair to be converted into a birthing chair. Here again we see the hand grips, not just added to the arms but secured with steel bands to prevent them being broken off during travail. Next is this, known as the miraculous chair of Palermo. As you can see, this chair could fold for easy carrying by the midwife. When opened, its sides raise up into hand grips, the seat is padded in leather for the comfort of the mother, and on the back of the chair is an icon of Christ. This chair belonged to one midwife family and is said to have been the chair that delivered over 2,000 babies alive. For the time, considering the chair dated back to somewhere between 1730 and 1800, a truly miraculous seat. Lastly was this image I found from the Hague Museum, a birth chair dated to 1743. This one is remarkable not because of its design, but because of its size. This is a birth chair from a child's dollhouse. I find it fascinating that the birth chair was so common and so essential to family life that even little girls playing with their dolls and toys knew that they would one day give birth from a birth chair. And just for fun, I'd like to suggest this chair for an honorable mention. This leather padded chair with its brace for reclining and sacral support pillow and its steel-banded hand grips could never be complete without the beginning of stirrups. For all the ladies out there, I'd like to thank the designer of early obstetric stirrups. What would life be like without them? I began to run into trouble finding information about the tools of the midwife about the middle of the 19th century, and I confess I was getting very frustrated. Then it dawned on me why I was having trouble finding information about midwifery at this point in history, and the reason is very simple. Midwives were being pressured and in some places even outlawed out of the mainstream by their male counterparts, the rapidly growing numbers of man midwives. They who were the progeny of barber surgeons and the forebears of doctors and obstetricians who muscled their way into the birthing chamber. In this first image, we can see this laboring woman is placed up high on some piece of furniture or other, and although she is supported and cared for by women, the attendant tending to the job of catching her baby is a male doctor. Notice how she has a large drape or sheet over her legs, and that drape is tied around the doctor's neck. He works with his hands underneath the sheet. It would of course be indecent for this man to look at her genitalia. As you can see in all these images, from texts in the middle to late 19th century, male doctors cared for pregnant and laboring women only by feel and not by sight. But even in this time period, away from urban centers among the very poor, and on the plains, women were still giving birth, attended by women, and often having no one but a daughter at their side. Wednesday the 16th. Rose about 5 o'clock, had breakfast, got my housework done about 9, baked 6 more loaves of bread, made a kettle of mush, and have now some pudding and some beef boiling. My girl has ironed, and I have made out to put my clothes away and set my house in order. May the mercy of the merciful be with me through the expected scene. 9 o'clock p.m. was delivered of a son. The growing body of the medical profession and their well-to-do lobbying arms were making great changes in birth around the world. Men were enrolling specifically to study obstetrics and pediatrics, and hospitals were becoming the norm for giving birth, replacing the home as lying-in hospitals began popping up in cities and even in more rural locales. Doctors became the new experts in birth, and midwives were eschewed as dirty, uneducated, superstitious old crones. Royals and other famous people gave birth attended by physicians rather than midwives, and anyone who was anyone wanted to do the same as well. Queen Victoria even delivered her two youngest children with the aid of chloroform for relief of pain. With the increasing numbers of people seeking a doctor's assistance at birth, the tools of the obstetrician became more prevalent, and women were giving birth assisted in ways their mothers would never have imagined or likely welcomed. In this last photo from the lying-in hospital in New York City, you can see here the set of a standard delivery room. The woman's privacy or need for security given to the roll-away curtain frame. Any wastes or fluids from the birth handily collected in the rubber ring cushion that conveniently drains into a bucket, and her comfort addressed by the high, narrow table padded with a sheet. And of course, for busy times, the room is quite large enough to accommodate two laboring women at the same time, perhaps even attended by the same doctor. The evident sterility of this scene is at once deceptive and distressing. Medical men delved even further into obstetrics, continuing to change a once natural event into a surgical one. Drugs were more and more frequently used to simplify labor. In 1914, twilight sleep was introduced to American women by McClure's magazine, and even after the morphine scopolamine cocktail was no longer in use, scopolamine, the chemical equivalent of a temporary frontal lobotomy, continued to be used even into the 1960s. Great numbers of women gave birth rendered all but senseless, strapped wrist and ankle to surgical suite tables. Still feeling the pain, but not in their right mind to cope with it, they were restrained and effectively straitjacketed for their own safety. Fathers or other family members were not permitted to be an aid or partner to the laboring woman, and saw only the glowing cherub, cleaned, dry, and picture perfect, but only through the visiting window glass. While this was carrying on in urban and suburban centers around the world, the granny midwives of the Southeast and the curandera parteris midwives of New Mexico tribes and other women in the U.S. and in other Western countries were helping women to deliver their babies in the old-fashioned way they had been for hundreds of years before health departments stepped in to train them. Fortunately, midwifery skills were never forgotten entirely. Even as these became common scenes around the U.S. and parts of Europe, and women rallied and marched for their rights to bodily freedom and for wide acceptance of the use of birth control, this remained the scene in the delivery room. Note the caption here. On the delivery table, Jean grabs the handles, takes a deep breath, and bears down. Things to note in this picture are the lambskin padded leather cuffs just below her wrist, and the tanks of oxygen and laughing gas that could be used at a moment's notice if Jean gets out of control. Notice, too, that Jean, unlike her forebears, is giving birth from flat on her back, rather than sitting up in a birth chair that could be taking advantage of gravity and of a more open pelvis. For most women, things still hadn't changed even in the later 1980s. The laboring woman remains on her back, but at least now her husband and a support person are present. And again, in the 1990s, we see that still nothing much had changed and women were still giving birth in lithotomy. But for some, a return to traditional midwifery in the U.S. happened quite naturally, beginning in 1970. At first, this was only common in certain circles, but soon word began to get out, and women began to seek midwives. But in all this, midwives, who never went out of vogue in other parts of the world than the Western world, have been making a comeback as women have once again sought women to help them in their time of pregnancy, labor, and delivery. The tools of the modern midwife vary from locale to locale and midwife to midwife. Some of the more common are the Pinard, a tape measure, a Doppler, birth stools and furnitures designed for the mother's comfort during her labor, portable birthing tubs, and in this midwife kit from the Direct Relief International Group, we can see tools and solutions for sterilization, tools for general health checks, bulb syringe, and various scissors, sutures, and clamps. There are so many different options available as midwives' tools today, depending on how and where a midwife chooses to practice. And yet, with all of the modern tools that are available to midwives, some things remain the same from the earliest records of ancient times. A midwife needs sense, intelligence, a reliable character, steady nerve and a reassuring presence, skill, a compassionate, empathetic heart, a love for women, for babies, and for birth, respect for individuals, cultures, and traditions. But perhaps the most important tool that a midwife has is her hands.